So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also interview special guests involved in writing and publishing. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. As I record this, the crowdfund on BackerKit for Beating Hearts and Battle Axes, the romance and spice-infused sword and sorcery anthology, which is Brackenbury Books' first adventure into the world of book publishing, is live, and will be live until July 20th, roughly noon Eastern Standard Time. I say roughly, sometimes these things can go into a little bit of overtime. Yeah, eventually you'll be able to get the book later, of course, because luckily we have hit our minimum funding goal as I say these words, but you want to get in on the crowdfund for a whole bunch of really cool exclusives like full color lovely bookmarks. And I should hope for anyone listening to this podcast, this would be particularly interesting, a original short story written by yours truly called Pagan Poetry, 6,000 words written in the sort of vibe and vein of the anthology, and will come with any size pledge as a digital extra. Not too shabby, IMHO, which stands for International Monetary Hog Orifice. Anyway, that's something to be aware of. Meanwhile, New Edge Sword and Sorcery is not the only sword and sorcery magazine expanding into the world of book publishing. Unless this is your first episode of So I'm Writing a Novel, it's quite likely you've heard me mention Whetstone, an amateur magazine of sword and sorcery. They have opened up the Keen Blades imprint for publishing books that push the boundaries of sword and sorcery, is essentially their remit, and their very first book has come out quite recently. That would be called Hurled Headlong Flaming, or The Bishop's Tale, written by Matt Holder. If you've listened to any of the New Edge Sword and Sorcery short story panel discussions on here and elsewhere, the odds are pretty decent you've heard Matt's voice. He's a pretty smart fella, and I really enjoy his opinions on the genre, which is why I've repeatedly invited him back to those panel discussions. So why not check out the novel written by the guy who's got smart sword and sorcery opinions, in my opinion. IMHO, International Monetary Hog Orifice. Yes, so without further ado, this novella, which is a preferred format of mine for sword and sorcery, the novella, it follows a priest on a perilous quest to a hellish underworld to retrieve an ancient manuscript he believes can help prevent the apocalypse. It's pretty solid stuff, and I'm going to let Matt tell you about it rather than me burble too much here. So let's go to the interview. And here I am with Matt Holder. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Oliver, how are you?
I'm doing well. I really enjoyed our long conversation about all the nitty-gritty of Indie Pub and so on that we did before the interview. That's podcast tradition. Have a little pre-interview. Oh well. But yeah, let's not waste any time here. Let's get into discussing Hurled Headlong Flaming, or The Bishop's Tale, and its author, Matt Holder. And to that end, Matt, I would like to ask, in a nutshell, what is your creative writing origin story? Have you been writing fiction since you could pick up a crayon, or was it something you kind of like went, okay, actually, I want to go turn right into this? When you were in your 20s, like what's the broad strokes of your creative writing?
So it has been something that I've been wanting to do or doing for a long time in one form or another, like all the way back to, I don't know about elementary school, but probably elementary school. I used to make comics with my friends. I was super inspired by George and Harold from the Captain Underpants books, who would make comics and sell them on the playground. And so I did that with my friends. I remember one of my early writings. My mom got me, like, you can go to Hobby Lobby or some other hobby shop, Michael's, and get like sort of pre-made books, right? Little like cloth bound books that you would, write in. And this thing was like super thin. And this would have been, we were living in Michigan at the time, so it had to have been when I was in elementary school. But she got me that, and I was way into the He-Man cartoon, the 2000X He-Man cartoon that was on at the time. And I remember writing my own little He-Man story in that. The first big epic, though, that I remember embarking on was like fifth, sixth grade. I was way into Warhammer 40K.
Mm.
And I wrote this. I don't even know what the assignment was, but we all had to write something that somehow involved some like scientific process or whatever. So I wrote this like Warhammer 40K fanfic, basically, that ultimately some guy was stranded on an island and he had to like figure out how to create electricity or something using, I don't know, like it was weird, but it's definitely been something that I remember writing stories about the Revolutionary War because I was way into history. And I was obsessed with this Liberty's Kid PBS TV show when I was really young, and I would write stories about it. And then in college, really in high school and college, I feel like I didn't do too much writing. Undergrad, that is. When I got more into grad school, uh, I started to do a lot more fiction writing, and it picked up a lot toward the end of my undergrad and then into grad school. I started writing a lot of like contemporary realist fiction, like the sort of stuff that you're quote unquote like supposed to write in fiction classes.
Like
but
more literary works, you went
yeah,
down
like
that, yeah.
literary works, again, stuff about like drama, like household drama, the
Kitchen
drill.
sink stuff.
Yeah, Dennis Johnson type stuff. And then I read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy again as an undergrad toward the end of my undergrad career, and it like I had read The Road previously, but The Road in McCarthy's like canon is probably his most accessible book, and when I read Blood Meridian, it sort of just like blew me away, and it got me like super excited about writing and language again. And so, and kind of ever since then, I don't do it near as much as I would like, just for time and stuff. But
Mhm.
I did NaNoWriMo one year, and I wrote my first like novel that was kind of like a Western mixed with some sci-fi elements. And then I wrote a novel about some monks in a monastery, translating a manuscript. And
Cool.
then I wrote short stories in between all throughout, but in terms of longer works. And then from that novel, I wrote this, Hurled Headlong Flaming, which is a prequel, more or less, to that novel. This is the story of like how the manuscript is acquired that the monks are
Oh, okay.
transcribing. Um, and so yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell, sort of my right. Along the way, and probably I still am. I'm a lot more of an academic writer than I am a fiction writer. Like I probably write more nonfiction, not currently, but I've written more nonfiction than I have fiction.
Oh yeah, well that makes sense given your profession. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Blood Meridian and you mentioned Warhammer 40K. Oh hey, quick sub question. What was your army?
Oh, Space Marines. I was, very basic, but
It's all good. Any particular chapter or
no, I would create my own. Very simple.
nice?
I spray painted them black, and I did their shoulder pads red, and I painted the guns metal, and that was
All right, on ya.
that
Nothing wrong
was.
with that. Nothing wrong with that.
There's a reason that Space Marines are so like they make the models so that they're easy to paint, right? The Space Marines particularly.
Oh yeah,
Um,
no, for sure. I played
they're
Eldar back in the day, and they are much more fiddly.
yeah, all the little finicky little pieces and fins and stuff. But yeah, I
Mm.
was I was so into it. It was right at the age, right? It was middle school or like late elementary, middle school, where that stuff feels almost dangerous, especially because, and I was raised in a pretty religious household where like the Chaos Space Marines, like that was like
Yeah.
almost off limits, right? Like you couldn't even play them or think about them
Those
because
Slaneshi demonettes, I mean, that's not okay. That's not okay.
yeah,
They got
it's
one boob out.
yeah, they're all super bad. But Warhammer 40K was super influential for me. Um, but yeah, I was a Space Marine guy, and still to this, I haven't played in forever, but I still have several of my Space Marine models. And
Well, nice. So okay, so that was in the mix. So you got the 40K, we got the Blood Meridian, and other things. But could you now sort of narrow it down a little bit, reviewing back over your sort of creative writing journey? what was your sword and sorcery origin story? Would you say what was how did you come into it? Why did it appeal to you?
So I think it started with, like I said, probably the He-Man cartoon. The
Yeah.
2000 X He-Man cartoon would have been my first exposure to what would have maybe been sword and sorcery. I wouldn't have called it that or recognized it at the time. I do know I saw the Conan the Barbarian movie pretty young, like again, probably elementary, like younger than you should be when you watch that movie. But I
You
remember,
say that, and yet I know so many people, myself included, who saw it when we were quote unquote too young, and it's gotten to
yeah,
a point now where I'm like, I think you are supposed to see it when you're 7.
I know it stays with you forever, for good and ill. And so I was way into that. I loved it, and this is there's a weird, not coincidence, but just happenstance. But like I know that I had, so those first Del Rey Conans came out. I want to say in the early 2000s, around that time. I could be wrong.
Mhm. No, you're right. It was
Um,
about the 2005.
but
Whatever.
I know that
Okay, don't quote me, but in that neck of the woods, yes.
I know that I had a copy of the first Conan volume, like The Coming of the Cimmerian, and I had the horror collection, Robert E. Howard's horror tales. And there was a time where I was just so in love with that stuff. Also Lovecraft, like I probably read Lovecraft first, and then that led me to Robert E. Howard. Um, and I remember, and even today, like the reason that I like that stuff, Robert E. Howard stuff, is because his writing style itself. I think that's what separates it so much from a lot of the other stuff that I was reading at the time. It felt so like strange and almost alien relative to, whatever was coming out at the time in terms of contemporary sci-fi fantasy.
Hmm.
I was always a sci-fi fantasy guy. Um, and then so like from in early years, that stuff sort of stuck with me. I wouldn't say that I read too much outside of that. Like I didn't read Fritz Leiber. I did not read Michael Moorcock till much later. Um, and again, uh, it was really at those sort of formative years,
Hmm.
Lovecraft and Howard, and I think a lot of those pulp guys, they're their writing is so strange when you read it as a kid in like the early 2000s or whatever. Um, same effect with like Cormac McCarthy, right? It's the writing itself that'll really blow you away. And honestly, you could say the same thing about the Conan the Barbarian film. It's not necessarily that I was attracted to big muscly dudes, um, and whatever the story was, but like that film feels so distinct, in terms of its tone, in terms of its style, and it like is entrancing. And it, and I think anyone that's seen it or especially saw it when you're at that impressionable age, like knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Hmm.
But And that was it. And then probably like around a little bit before pandemic times, so like I don't know, 2018, 2019, I got way back in to Conan and I read all the stories again. Um, Along the way, too, the Dark Horse comic of Conan, I had a trade paperback of that, one of them, and I read it like a million times. I was so obsessed. It was so cool. The art was amazing. I picked up the Marvel comics again in my teen years a bit later, which I also enjoyed. Not as much as the Dark Horse stuff, but and then, like I said, around pre-pandemic time, I got way back into it. That's when I actually started to read a lot more of the Moorcock stuff, and that sort of blew me away. I mean, I read Game of Thrones, which isn't really sword and sorcery, but sort of, kind
It
of.
has a lot of that DNA in there, right? I mean,
Yes,
I think
yeah,
Game of Thrones always to me feels like what if epic fantasy, but from a more
yes,
of an S&S point of view.
yeah,
Like it's almost like it's like a in filming you have like a colored gel in front of a light.
yeah.
S&S is the red gel in front of the light of epic fantasy. With Game of Thrones, yeah.
But yeah, I love the Hellboy comic by Mike Mignola is probably one of my favorite pieces of modern art of all
Mm.
time, and I think S&S and pulp and Lovecraft is so like injected into that DNA that
Mhm,
that is
absolutely.
also like forever influenced. I think what he accomplished with that work, again, one of the probably like the greatest contemporary comic, pop comic that we've seen in the last 10 years. I think it's incredible. Um, and that stuff is also always.
I
Right.
regret to inform you that you are closer to the grave than you realize. Hellboy is more like 25 years old. But
That is
especially with like
true.
the
That's true.
especially when you
I'm
bring in like
thinking,
BPRD, right? Like
yeah,
which became its
90.
own
Yeah,
series.
BPRD ended not too long ago. Hellboy in Hell, like the last Hellboy miniseries, which I think probably closer to like 2010s. I don't know, somewhere in there.
Something like that,
Um,
yeah.
those 9 issues, again, I think are incredible. Like, I don't know of another modern pop comic that even comes close to like what Mignola was trying to do with that series.
So,
It's
so these are titles that you love, and I think Hellboy in Hell is a good title to finish on listing titles because, of course, it's a person going down into hell, which may have some relevance to your book. Um, and you only mentioned maybe one of the qualities, which is like the unique, weird prose, right? Like it tends to be more the author's prose than the ideas necessarily that gripped you in SNS. It sounds like. Okay, so would there be any other like qualities, not so much titles about the SNS that make you come back to it, make you think like this is where I want to tread?
I like that SNS directly engages with violence as part of its sort of MO. Um, I in my PhD studies, I worked a lot with violence and representations of violence, so that sort of carries over from there. But I
Hmm.
like that it's sort of baked into the genre, and not only baked into the genre, but it's baked into the form. Because the other element of SNS that I do like is its sort of almost breathless quality to its prose. It's sort of, I don't want to say snappy because that seems wrong,
No,
but
but there's a pacing
there's
to
a, yeah,
what feels like
exactly.
the
There's a
platonic
pacing
ideal
to
of
it, like a
SNS.
propulsiveness to it, which is not,
Mhm.
which is true of a lot of pulp. Um, but compared to like Lovecraft, whose prose is much more like methodical and I mean, Howard is methodical in his own way, but it's a question of like degree and intent. And I think yeah, his pace is doing something that really attracts me. I see it too in Michael Moorcock, whose pace is like also breathless. Like a million ideas will go by in like 2 pages, and you're like, where are we right now? We've visited like 4 dimensions in a paragraph. And I love that. I love just how incredible, like that compact nature, which is part of why, like, Milton's Paradise Lost, greatest thing ever written in the English language, like bar none. Um, but the compactness of the verse, I think, is something that I see as well in um, Sword and Sorcery, particularly. Trying to go for that like epic, almost like Homeric quality,
Mm.
um, and so and it's fun too. Like there's, it's almost like you have permission to do things that, in terms of like the arc of contemporary sort of realist fiction, which um, sort of, and this is like generalizing, but it has a more deliberate sort of pace about it, where you're trying, like, it, once you get into the heads of characters and do these build these things out, and I'm not opposed to that at all, but I do like the, just the permission to just, just go with it and define your characters very much by their actions,
Mhm.
which I, which is kind of like storytelling 101, right? Like, you should show your character doing something, and that's how you know who they are. um, but I mean, those are, there you go. That's what I got right now off the top of my head.
I accept you for who you are. All right, now forgive me if I'm starting to sound a bit similar in my questions, but I feel like this is a Russian nesting doll situation for our first few. We've talked about your creative writing origin story and your sword and sorcery origin story, and you've touched upon it a little bit. But what is the origin story of this book, Hurled Headlong Flaming? Okay, it's a prequel to an idea that you wrote a few years back, but like, what made you decide, hey, I need to write that prequel, and like, what got the ball rolling there, and what was the rough timeline from the first light bulb over your head that made you want to write the thing to publication?
So, very originally, my friend and I had sat down and we wanted to write a screenplay. And it very much started from the notion that bookworms are a real thing. Like, they're a real thing that when you look at manuscripts, you can see where like the little bug or parasite has like ate its way into the manuscript. So, so it was like a real thing. So I was like, all right, let's start there. And the screenplay eventually fell away, and I just went and wrote the novel. And then when it, in terms of like doing the novella, what I wanted to do was, so the novel is very like more contemporary realist in its mode, meaning that it follows three different characters. It's very much about relationships. The whole thing takes place across not that much time. It's very sort of, the pace is a lot more spread out and it's longer. And with the novella, I wanted to do something completely different. Like I get bored easily and I lack kind of discipline in writing. And so I wanted to do something different. So I thought I want to write something that is much more crazy in scale. I want to write something that um, is just really kind of off the rails in terms of some of the things that happen. And I want to try and do it in like half the length because I think that compression sort of forces you to make different choices. And I wanted to just try that out and see what would, and again, part of it was just I wanted to do something fun that I think would be fun as a writer. And so that's where it came from. Also, I had been rereading again Paradise Lost, and I had been rereading Dante's Inferno. And I wanted to sort of, again, this sort of descent into the underworld, into hell, is like a timeless motif, like literally in Western literature going back millennia. And I basically wanted to just do my version of that. Like I wanted to do that. And I was bringing into it a lot of the stuff that I had studied and thought about more from writing the book. I wanted to play with different forms in a way. The novel itself, again, it changes tenses like halfway through. Because again, I sort of lack discipline as a writer, and I want to try to like change how the book is read because it changes how I write and it keeps it interesting. And it has like poetry in there. And
I would
so,
gently push back on your claim of a lack of discipline because, especially someone who's done a lot of developmental editing, there's the issue. It was actually another something we discussed before we started recording of intention, right? Yeah, when people just kind of slide in and out of like third person, first person, whatever, that's lack of discipline. You made creative choices in writing this
yeah,
book. I feel
they were definitely choices. And one other influence that sort of has some bearing here, I had read uh, a lot more of Alan Moore's prose. So like his what is his short story collection? It's like something of fire, Voice of the Fire, and then he wrote a book called Jerusalem,
I was about to say, have you read Jerusalem?
which is like I have attempted to read most of Jerusalem, which is the but I got through enough of it. I got through like part two, I think, and it's three parts.
For those who
Um,
don't know, Jerusalem is 1,200 pages,
it's freaking long and it's
something like that.
incredible. Like for whatever people think about Alan Moore and his comics, whatever.
Mm.
Um, I think he's hilarious as just the grumpy old man. But I also think as a writer, he's kind of brilliant. And that
Yeah.
book plays with form. Like he'll do a whole section, and I'm talking like 40 to 50 pages and like some James Joycean diction. And then he'll do another one that's in like heroic verse. And I was just like, this is like, you can do this. Like, I know people have done it before, but for me, reading that, I was like, you can do whatever you want, man. And granted, I am not Alan Moore by any stretch of the imagination, but part of the, playing in the indie space, part of what it allows you to do is to just take those risks. Whether or not it pays off in some sort of commercial way is beside the point. And I
Well, actually,
knew,
what you just perfectly transitioned. Thank you
yeah,
to my next question, which is this: the Keen Blade series quote aims to expand the boundaries of what sword and sorcery can be. How do you feel Hurled Headlong does that?
um, I think, I think, one of the elements that's particularly strong in this that I don't see a lot in SNS, mostly because SNS is usually in a secondary world. This is not necessarily. I wanted to talk about faith, and I wanted to talk about faith and its relationship to violence. And again, I don't. It feels weird to like pretentious to suggest that I was intentionally trying to like push the boundaries of something.
It's not
Um,
pretentious. You're getting self-conscious. I can see your face
yeah.
changing here. No, dude. Stand tall. You set out
if
to try and do
if I
something
had
that
to
was,
identify
pushing boundaries a little bit.
elements, yeah, I would say that I think the way that the novella approaches faith is maybe sort of pushing a little past maybe how particularly Howard approached religion. But I also think in terms of how I wanted to structure the thing, its form, um, is, I don't want to say experimental, but like pushing beyond the sort of um, like limited third POV the entire time. In a lot of ways, it's playing in the same space of SNS, but there are just a few elements where I'm trying to sort of, because frankly, like we all have read those stories a million times. Like I've read that type of story, and I wanted to. The protagonist is someone who genuinely like wants to save people, which has more, there's nothing mercenary about his motivations, which is slightly different from some, not necessarily always, but slightly more, he's a priest, right?
Yeah.
And he's genuine about it. Excuse me.
It does feel very
So
personal.
what?
It does feel very personal.
Yeah, it's
He's
very
not like
personal.
detached from what he's doing and be like, well, this is my job. So
Yes.
I would say still very SNS in that sense. He's not
um
trying to fill his pockets with gold.
yeah, so those are the elements, I guess, that I would point to and say that it's pushing the boundaries. How it approaches faith and how it deals with faith's relationship to violence. I would like to say that what it's talking about in regards to violence is boundary pushing, but excuse me, it's not necessarily. I've seen a lot of authors do similar things, but also like using the dialogue form and then using an epistolary form in the same sort of like confined space. When I think about what pushes boundaries for me, it's always going to be a formal question. It's going to be a question. It's not necessarily character, plot, setting, etc. I do think those things are important, and I think they can push things. But when I think about like an art form, what does push it forward is an aesthetic difference. And when you say an aesthetic difference, you're talking about form. And in a lot of ways, form and content is like a false dichotomy. It's not, they're in a lot of ways the same thing.
Mm.
But when I write, I'm thinking first about what is this doing, like structurally and formally, like what are the diction and syntax choices that I'm making. And again, I probably like, whether or not it's executed, whether or not it like coheres, right? Those are the things that I'm thinking about in terms of how do I want this to be like different and distinct, if that
Right
makes sense.
on. So okay, I sort of two sub questions there. One is, what do you feel then? Like, for example, just pick one aspect. As you say, you've got a section in dialogue, a section in epistolary format. What do you feel you gained by switching to those formats?
So one of them, part of what I gain again is an excuse for me to like try out a different form. But one of the things it does for you as a writer is it changes how you write. So like when you're writing straight dialogue, you, especially in the dialogue mode, you're very conscious of how performative the whole thing is, almost like a drama, right?
Mhm.
um and it gave me an opportunity to reveal a different side of the character of the bishop than I had previously, because he talks a little bit in part one, but he's mostly not talking that much. um so it gave me an opportunity to sort of let him speak, but he's still speaking in like a performative register. Like he understands that this is like a play he's putting on. It changes, again, it changes how you write. It also, specifically with the dialogue, if they're going to talk questions of philosophy, I kind of wanted to put it in the philosophical dialogue mode. Again, that's just like English lit nerd stuff. But then the epistolary, right, is a whole other different type of method that you can use to reveal characterization, because the epistolary is theoretically um, the most intimate you can get with a character. And I say theoretically because the character could be lying to themselves or to the audience.
Mm.
But in my head, those are the bishop's sort of, that's his conscious, more or less. There are still things he's not quite keying into, but he's not going to be aware of that in the same way that we're not. But so that's another way that it allowed me to sort of almost recharacterize the bishop, because that's a section where you get a lot more of his own like doubt, where he's like, what's even happening right now? Um, so that's sort of, I wouldn't say that initially when I wrote those, I was thinking like that. I was just thinking like, this will be fun to do something different. And that's like the extent of it. But as I sort of started to do it and got further into it, I was thinking in terms of so form affords you certain things. And so I was thinking in terms of, what does this afford me to do? And what it afforded me to do, what it afforded me or allowed me to do was reveal different elements of the bishop's character and reveal maybe some elements of how the world works in terms of like an imaginary space. Um,
Right on. And
yeah.
something I think about a lot when people, like, whether I'm writing my own stuff, I don't want to talk about me here, but there's a smidge of overlap in the sense that with New Age Sword and Sorcery and what I'm doing there, I'm trying to like push things in my own way. And with my own writing, I'm trying to think of like, well, how much can I stretch the boundaries of SNS while still keeping it recognizable as such, right?
Yeah.
Many of the time as an author, pardon me, just as a reader or often as an editor, I've come across stories where people say, oh, I'm not playing by the rules. And you read it and you're like, yeah, you're not. This isn't SNS. I'm not talking about the quality. I'm just saying you made, chocolate pecan pie and you're telling me it's apple cinnamon. It's just
Yeah.
pure categorization. And so when you yourself were thinking about, I know you didn't set in this like, I'm going to reinvent SNS, like, but like I say, the remit of the publisher is to push boundaries. That must have been on your mind a little bit when writing. So my point is, where do you, as an author with your own work, or if you want to make it a little more comfortably distanced as a reader of other people's work, where do you put the line in terms of pushing boundaries and doing exciting new things within the genre versus just like, fuck it, you're in another category?
Yeah.
Like, how do you do that? How do you draw that line?
Yeah. I don't know, because I do like genre signifiers. Like, I like that genres have certain rules, and this is what makes it recognizably the genre. So I like that SNS has like a kind of specific type of protagonist who's very sort of like self-determining, strong-willed, etc. I like that it has a propulsive pace. I like that the writing should have a certain type of energy to it. Lots of like very specific verbs describing action, right?
Mhm.
In terms of like nuts and bolts stuff. I like that the world building can happen in quick brushstrokes. Like, that's the intent. But in terms of like where the line is, I don't know, because which is my way of not answering the question, but
I mean, that's not right. Is it vibes? Can we just say it's vibes? Like, I
it's
just feel
very
it.
much vibes. Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of vibes. Because even if you look at like sort of classic authors or whatever, you look at Howard, you look at Leiber, you look at Moorcock, you look at Vance, maybe you look at Clark Ashton Smith. Those writers, in terms of their style, are very different. And some could argue that Vance maybe strays too far.
He's very sort of soft edge case, I find, with SNS,
Yeah,
but I'm happy to put
uh-huh.
him in there myself.
But like, uh, you can still play in the space, and I think um, part of well, I guess on the other hand, I should say that um, in terms of genres pushing boundaries, there is an element where you have to sort of break something to build something else and to go somewhere else. I wouldn't say that I know what that line is. Like I said before, I think it's a formal line. I think
Mhm.
how you approach the form. Like, I don't. So part of SNS's form is its length, right? It's short.
Yep.
So it's either short story, novelette, novella. That's where people generally agree. Like, that's where its strengths are. Um,
Or your sort of classic, like pre-80,
yes, yeah.
novel
Mhm.
that's like 60,000 words or something. Like,
Yes.
yeah.
When you start to go beyond that, you can feel things start to stretch. But that isn't to say that, like, I think it would be possible in terms of like where the genre could go that would maybe push boundaries would be to someone to take up the length issue. Like, could you maintain the SNS style in a longer form? Now, I personally am like, I don't think so because I haven't seen that happen. Like I've read some of the longer Conan books. Like I read, what is it? Blood of the
Hour of the
Serpent.
Dragon?
No, not Hour of the Dragon. I think rides the line, right? But it's still a short novel, you
It,
know.
it also feels like a series of episodes, but then that
It's
has
yeah,
its
it's
own unique
basically a
publication
series of
history.
episodes. Yeah,
Yeah, like it was a whole thing of Howard repackaging a bunch of stuff to try and break into the European market, if I remember
yeah.
correctly. So that's a whole other. Maybe that's not the best example.
But I read S.M. Sterling's Conan book from like a year or two ago, Titans First, whatever. And
Yes,
part of the sorry, what?
I just said yes. Go on.
Oh yeah, and part of the issue, and it's fine enough, but I do think part of the issue is like this is too long. Like, why is this so long? Um, and there are other things that I sort of had issues with, but yeah, I don't know. Like where the line is, I don't know because there's a part of me again that does like genre signifiers. I like playing in the sandbox. That's why I wanted to write in the sandbox. Um, the way that I write violence in this book is very much coming from an SNS space. Uh,
That did
but I
surprise me,
also,
by the way, when I was reading, because at first I was like, "Oh, we're following a bishop. All right, probably not going to be a lot of heads getting cut off when we're following a religious man." And then I was like, "Oh, I see."
yeah, I wanted him to be like he's a really violent person, which is at odds with like what he believes fundamentally, and I think that's really interesting. And very realistic, like not only it happened back then and it still happens today. Um, but But yeah, there's also a part of me that's like, I don't care about the rules. I don't care what the audience wants. I don't care what the expectations are. I don't want to write with those sort of different type of shackles, Uh, um, but I don't know. It's a balance, right? Like I don't
And
want
you feel
to.
different on different days, The
Yeah,
amount of times I've
yeah,
been like, I hate
absolutely.
when people do blah and they tell me it's sword and sorcery, and then I'll turn around like 2 days later and read something and be like, this is great, sword and sorcery, and it's got that in it.
Yeah,
We have to remember, like, we ourselves are not static in our tastes and,
right.
and
Yeah,
desires day to day.
I wanted to. I think in terms of others like genre or boundary pushing, whatever, like I think SNS has always been engaged with like a thematic weight that I think is sometimes missing and basically questions of philosophy. And I
Mhm.
know immediately some people are like, no, no, I don't want none of this.
Well,
But
yeah, like
Howard
Lynn
was like,
Carter's opening to Conan the Buccaneer has entered the chat, where he's just like, I
yes,
don't want people to have to think about things like
yeah,
Spiro Agnew and taxes. Like, what? Like,
yeah.
just entertainment, no thoughts, only vibes. And like, okay, okay. Like, did you read the
Howard
same Conan I did?
was, yeah, I don't want to say he was a philosophical writer, but he might not have been that far from it. Those guys, they were thinking about this stuff. They also read a lot more, frankly, than probably a lot of their audience, even today. But and not just their own stuff. They read widely. Okay, that's if you want to just caveat, if you want to like do something different, you have to read outside. You have to read within the genre, right? But
God,
you
yes.
have to read outside. You have to. Otherwise you're going to keep anyway. So,
No, I know what
but
you mean. Sometimes people put it as they're like, well, you have to ignore the past, or you have to ignore the present and focus on the past, or you have to ignore both and just look outside the genre and then put the genre's hat on something else entirely. And it's like, no, man, you got to read all of it. You got to read all of it. You got to read the classics. You got to read the contemporary. You got
yeah.
to read outside of the genre entirely. Sorry, you want to write, you got to do a lot of reading.
Yeah, I mean that has never changed. And but anyway, like Conan, there's way more philosophy in those. So in terms of what I wanted to do with my stuff, and maybe this is like again, not pushing the boundary, but maybe just taking it further than where it had been, or just like it's a matter of focus in some ways, right? Like what if we turn the focus just a little bit onto this element that I think was always there, and I'm not the only one, right? Like other people
Yeah.
have identified philosophy in those stories. What if we had a full-on discussion of a philosophical paradigm issue? And what if it was about power, which Howard's stories are also deeply invested in questions of power,
Mhm.
whether or not they were on the surface or whether or not they were sort of beneath the surface. But like Conan's position as king is directly a question of how do you wield power and how do you exercise it, which is very different from when he's like a pirate.
Yeah.
But
Well, you know what? This is again, you've done me the kindness of an easy segue because I feel like we're blurring over into my next question, so I may as well throw it at you.
mhm.
So yeah, I mean, it's right there on the back copy, and also you mentioned it a bit earlier in our chat today. You know, Dante, Milton, Lovecraft, all influences on this story. Could you tell us a little bit about your relationship to those authors and why them instead of, say, writing a novella influenced mainly by, I don't know, Tolkien, Mercedes Lackey, and Jack Handy? I don't know. You know, like why those three in particular? I mean, obviously Howard's in the mix because you love the genre, but his name's not on the back of the book.
So I guess personally, I'm just really attracted to both the Inferno and Milton's Paradise Lost. All of Milton's writing, but particularly Paradise Lost. I'm attracted to the sort of scope and the ambition with what they're trying to do, especially with Milton, like trying to basically write the English version of the Aeneid and take up as his subject like the fall and redemption of humanity. And again, for Milton, like the stakes are high, not just from a sort of structural storytelling level, but the stakes are high because he like genuinely believes this stuff. Okay, he's talking about eternal ramifications, and I think there's something just really compelling about it. The imagination on the in those stories, like the imagery and the symbols that they conjure up, I think are just endlessly compelling. You know, again, not only for me but others. Again, the compactness of the verse, like the amount of detail you can get into like two lines, is sort of really compelling. In terms of Lovecraft, I do think Lovecraft probably had a stronger influence on me for a longer amount of time than Howard. And I think part of it is because of his style, which a lot of people, and this is like an endless debate, like was Lovecraft actually like a
Oh
good
man.
writer or did he like suck a lot? And we've all just sort of, and I think he definitely did not suck a lot. Again, uh, like his ability to use language is pretty impressive. From like a prose stylist point of view, from like a diction and syntax point of view, like he's extremely strong. What I think people might not respond to is like his storytelling, like again, a pace issue, a character issue. But see, Howard didn't, I mean, Lovecraft didn't care about that stuff, frankly.
No.
So, like, I think it's somewhat disingenuous to go to his work and think, wow, this is just going to be like, this is really going to carry me through with a breathless pace and just vividly drawn characters. Like, he did not care about that. Okay. So, like, he's not trying to deliver that story.
No, you want to look at the goals of the author rather than come in with your own.
Yeah.
This is what I want. Hey, they didn't make the sandwich I asked for.
But I think like the purplish prose, which I say like with compliments, again, Lovecraft is writing with like, I guess in terms of why I like all three of them, is because they're language first writers, meaning that I think that they think about the words before they think about anything else. And to me, that is what I respond to. That's why I like McCarthy, because I think he's also similar.
Hmm.
um Again, I'm sort of projecting, like I don't know if none of them probably genuinely sat down and said that or wrote that. um and I don't pretend to even come close to like their ability, but that's what inspires me as a writer, is people that approach writing like with um like language first. Like film, I'm the same way. Like I'm way more entranced by a director or a DP who's like, I care more about composition and light than I do
Yeah.
whatever's happening with with the characters. You know, um, like I like Terrence Malick. I
I knew
love,
you. I was about to say Terrence Malick. The second you said
yeah.
that, I was
Like,
like, oh, Terrence
you
Malick.
think he cares?
Huh?
Like, I mean, I'm sure he does, but you watch his movies not because you're like, man, this is going to be some like James Cameron level, you know,
Yeah, I can't wait for
storytelling
that third act
action.
twist. No.
Yeah, like no, no, no. Um, Even, and this may be controversial, but like I'm even like a Michael Bay fan because he just loves to shoot awesome stuff and he just wants to do it in the coolest way possible. And he does. Like he does not care about storytelling. He doesn't care
No,
about
like him or hate
character.
him, his priorities are clear.
Yes, he cares about how freaking cool this is going to look in the frame. And I definitely respect that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know he's an easy guy to hate on or whatever, but you're not wrong. He's got a voice. He's got a voice that we all know.
He is the best at what he does. Like seriously, like find me a better action director, maybe besides like James Cameron. I mean, I'm sure you. I say that and like a million names pop
Well,
into
you can
my
always
head.
argue these things, but you feel strongly enough to say, "Find me a better action
Yes.
director." Yeah.
But anyway, uh, again, and part of it too is like the Milton and the Dante come directly from just studying English literature for as long as I did. And that's not even my field of expertise. Like I studied contemporary American literature, not early
Mm.
modern literature, and definitely not early modern Italian literature. Um, but so my love for them also comes out of this like academic space that I have.
Actually, sorry if I may interrupt. That just what you said there made me think. Have you read Orlando Furioso?
I have not. No, it's been recommended to me a lot, but I have not read it.
Okay, well, like a Reddit upvote put me on there. I think you should read it, given everything I've seen in
Yeah,
this
yeah,
book
I'll
and
check it
what we're
out.
discussing.
I love that old stuff too, because I guess another reason it's influential is because the worldview that those things capture, in some ways, is similar. We can recognize certain motivations, like why they do these things. But in other ways, it's so different. And I'm really compelled by that. And I think it's interesting. And it helps to channel some of that into, what I tried to do with the novella.
Mhm.
I wanted to just, well, I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah, I mean, if I can respond a little bit to some of what you said. First of all, just a brain disease I'm going to give you that blossomed in my mind as you were talking about how I think this is very cool talking about how like Dante, like he believed what he was writing, and the weight that can add to something is so hard to find. I mean, imagine clicking on YouTube and being like, when you want to design your magic system, make sure you believe it's actually how the universe functions.
Yeah, exactly. Uh-huh.
Just like we just learned some real interesting things about Brandon Sanderson.
Yeah.
But
I
so
mean,
yeah,
that was a direct, I wanted to write a character who genuinely believed, and not in a cynical way. Like he believes
mm,
in, his faith. And I think that, like, I am so tired of reading stories about people who like lose faith or question their faith or whatever, whatever, whatever. There's a difference between like self doubt, questioning yourself,
mhm.
and fundamentally questioning like what you believe like about the world
Yeah.
to its core. And certainly people in the early modern period like would doubt and lose their faith. But not near on the level that I think people like it was the norm. Like that's just what it was. Like if you were part of the Western world,
Yeah.
like, you definitely had strange, weird beliefs, but there was still like this tie to like a fundamental Christian system. But then it was mixed in with all this weird, like, uh, I don't want to say peasant beliefs because that sounds like derogatory, but like the beliefs of people who couldn't read.
Yeah,
Like
like local myth,
they had their
paganism, of
own like
course.
mixture of weird things they would bring into like standard like scripture narratives. Because imagine like you go to mass or whatever, all you get is whatever the priest says, and it's not even in your language mostly. And so you just like fill it in with all this weird stuff. But it's still like fundamentally you believe that like someone made all this stuff. Um, and
And what you fill in can be often the most compelling. I mean,
Yeah,
it's silly, but the same dynamic. I think about how when you collecting comics in the pre-digital age, and how as a kid you'd be like, "Well, I got issues 1, 9, and 12," and like,
yeah,
and you would
yep,
just fill in the gaps, and that would be amazing. Like I still remember, I still remember some of those ways I would do that as a child, and then
yeah,
I just imagine doing that for the rest of your life with how the
yeah,
universe works.
yes, yeah. Like what they keep saying, they keep talking about God and they keep talking about Jesus, and they do these like passion plays and stuff, but you don't have access to the text.
Yeah.
You can't read it. They've like purposefully kept it from you, which
And
is
actually, because
part of
go
why I
on,
wanted to do a bishop, someone who's like he's read the text, like he knows the stuff.
yeah.
Um,
Which
but
makes it
anyway,
more compelling to have him, be either sincere or doubting because, yeah,
yeah,
he's got that access.
hmm
Oh, and the only other thing I just wanted to mention, responding to what you said was, in terms of are these authors, we're discussing people who are intentional with their language. I would argue they are, but particularly I would say Cormac McCarthy. I mean, this is the man. Just look at his use of punctuation. There's a guy who's just like, I got a jar full of commas and that's it.
Yes,
I'm
that's
going to be
it.
real sparse with everything else. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's not you don't just fall into that. Like, I
Yes.
think he's a very language forward guy, and I think he makes that abundantly clear through his work.
He's so
But,
and I think like technically everyone's intentional with the language, right? Like writing is making choices. Like you have to choose the word. But there's just
there
a
are degrees
difference.
of intentionality.
Yes, there's a difference between, oh, I got to get this story out there, and how can I make this sentence like a crafted piece of art? Like there's a difference. And sometimes, a lot of times, you're flipping between the two, right? Because you're like, I don't have time to even think about, poetry right now. Okay. Like I'm just trying to like get things on the page.
For sure, I find that's a matter of drafts. For me, the first
Yeah.
draft is, it's the vomit draft. I'm like, this and this happens, and then it happens, and he says this, and that's cool, and just like get
Mhm.
out. And then in the editing is when I go back over and be like, okay, how can I like brocade this sentence? How can I make this thing pretty? How can the order of information be shifted around? And all that
Yeah.
stuff. What am I doing with my jar of commas? Yeah, like
Yeah. I remember recently, like Howard Andrew Jones has disclosed that part of his process in writing his Hanavar books is like, and I may be getting this wrong, but he
his
starts with like,
scaffolding method, I think, is what
yeah,
you're.
he
Yeah,
starts with like dialogue. He's like, let's just get what they say. And then you sort of like braid it out and you build it out. And I think that's a really like that's probably a way to work efficiently without sacrificing, like the craft aspect of it. And I also think it's just a way to activate different parts of your brain at different times, which will hopefully sort of bring more depth to the work as a whole, rather than try to do it all. It's painting up in layers, right? Like when you paint
yeah.
the background first, right, and then you build out toward the front, like you build up layers.
Yeah, no, I think his scaffolding method is really interesting. To me, it's like a hybrid, screenwriting and outlining
Yeah.
and a bit of prose, and then as you say, in layers until eventually you got the complete work. For anyone listening who wonders what the heck we're talking about, actually, if you go back through the archives of this very podcast to the most recent interview with Howard, we discuss his scaffolding method in depth. So I will leave that on the side. You can go back through. I forget what
There
episode
you
number,
go.
but it's not too
Yeah.
far ago. Um, to switch over to another author who I'd love to think about every chance I get because he is my absolute top author. I was delighted to see a very appropriate Kurt Vonnegut Jr. quote at the book's opening. And there is, in fact, a line on page 15, which I messaged you about for how it made me think of a book by his son, Mark. How much, I think maybe it's more subconscious, perhaps, if anything, but you tell me, how much would you say Vonnegut influenced this book or just your writing in general?
So I don't think so. I love Vonnegut. I teach Vonnegut as much as I can. I still think he is one of the more like he's still controversial. Like when I teach Slaughterhouse-Five, I'm like, this book is like, how is this book allowed still? I mean, I know it gets banned, but like I feel like I'm getting away with something every time I teach it. But I wouldn't say he's influenced me in like a stylistic way, right? Because I think like his style is very much. I don't think I could do that.
But maybe his like humanism, like it's just
Yes,
sardonic
but
humor.
his genuine like empathy for people, not only that, but also this always attracts me to a writer. It's one of the things I love about Terry Pratchett, who I see him and Vonnegut as kind of similar. They're so angry and you can feel the anger. And it's not like they're mad about, something petty. They're mad because things are unfair. And it's not like, oh, it's unfair. I didn't get the raise that I wanted. Things are unfair because we live in this culture with massive material wealth and people are dying outside because of exposure, right? It's unfair because like children are being murdered right now by bombs that my taxes pay for. Like, that anger is something that to me is so resonant and attracts me so much to Vonnegut. So like that quote about, him forbidding his sons from supporting people that think that we need weapons or machines that kill people. Again,
Well,
it's
hey, you
very
know what? It's not
simple.
that long a quote, so and
Yeah.
I've got it right here. So why don't we let the listener in on what we're discussing in case
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
unfamiliar
Yeah.
with it? So if you allow me a moment, or do you have a copy of? Why am I reading it? You got a copy of your book
I
there. Do
do.
you want to read
Yeah.
the
Let's
quote?
see. Turn in your hymnals, please.
Yeah.
Okay. I have told my sons that they are not under any circumstances to take part in massacres, and that the news of massacres of enemies is not to fill them with satisfaction or glee. I have also told them not to work for companies which make massacre machinery, and to express contempt for people who think we need machinery like that. And again, like the anger in that, there's another moment in that book where I can't remember the details, but like Vonnegut or his stand-in is meeting with a friend, and the friend's wife is crying and she's upset. And he's like, "Why are you so upset?" Because he's saying he's going to write this book. And she's like, "You're going to forget to tell them that it was kids that died for this. It was children, right? Children we sent over there to fight this war." Because they're
That's the
teenagers.
alternate title, The Children's Crusade. Yeah, and yeah,
Yes,
that's
and
the
like
opening. That was Vonnegut himself recounting a
that
personal
that
anecdote.
to me, like to be that boldly like anti-US military is very inspiring to me, and I find it just compelling, like to just admit, which doesn't seem like it should be that hard, but like maybe all this violence is not good. Like maybe we should stop doing it. But also not even stop killing each other, but to go a level further and to say you should not support institutions that think that we need this. And at the time in the novella, the church, the Catholic Church, is the institution that is instigating the war. And they're using their belief system to motivate it, which I think is, frankly, was and still is today to people that do it. Like, that's an evil thing. Like, I do
Yeah.
believe in good and evil. And I think Vonnegut did too. Like, I know he was not a religious person, but I do think he believed in good things. And I think he believed in evil. And I think I get that when I read some of his stuff. Or if not, and maybe again, not in like a moral sense, closer to an
Mm.
ethical sense and a sense of fairness and humanity. Because I don't want to like project my own beliefs onto Vonnegut. But like I know people that work or whose spouses work for Boeing in
Yeah.
the classified division of Boeing, and it's like, I wonder what they're building. It's not
Yeah.
good, and it makes me mad. Like it makes me mad that people think that that's okay. And again, I can't speak. I can't speak to people's situations, and you do what you got to do. But like, you go to be an engineer and you're going to make a bomb. Really? You're going to make a
Yeah.
bomb. And so that really makes me mad. And so that anger is something that I admire in Vonnegut, and it's something that I admire in Terry Pratchett, and it's something that the Bishop character is starting to realize. Like he doesn't have like he's not um like he recognizes that what he does is not good. Like he
Yeah.
tries to cleanse himself in the beginning, like his whole baptism sequence,
Mhm.
which is technically like a form of heresy because the type of baptism that he practices is not okay with the
Yeah.
church at the time. Which is not something I dwell on, but like for people that know, like that was a big, like he's like symbolically and physically separating himself from the institution that he sort of operates under through that baptism sequence. Um, anyway, that's just, yeah.
That's all good.
Uh,
You answered my question quite well. Thank you. I feel like we should chat about Vonnegut some more sometime off mic because yeah, I've got time for him all day long. Until
oh yeah.
recently, when I finally cleaned off my shelves a bit, I had a minimum of 3 editions of every single one of his novels.
Yeah, I'm not near as well read as I would like to be. Like he wrote so much. I've read a handful of his novels, but I know he wrote so many others. I've read some of his short stories.
I mean,
I also,
I'll cut myself off because I'm thinking, well, that's okay because in one of his essays he gave letter grades to his own work as a guide,
yeah, there
which
you
is
go.
funny
He
because he
just,
gave it like an F to the novel that made me fall in love with him in the first place. So I was like, what? But yeah. Anyway, I'll talk about him all day long, and we shouldn't. So I've got one last question. We've been having a good old chat here. Before we do the classic podcasty sign off stuff, I would like to ask you one more question. Now, it's not that academics are Martians. But did the fact that both you and your, editor slash publisher, Jason Ray Carney, also look through the archives, you can find me talking with him. Is the fact that both you and Jason are academics have any effect on the editorial process? Did it give you guys like a useful shorthand, or was it just irrelevant? And I'm, It's a silly question, but I don't know. It just felt that was kind of interesting that you guys would
Yeah,
have done
I
this.
don't know if there was like a shorthand or any direct influence. I will say that having Jason as the editor and the publisher, I knew that I could do and say certain things, and he would recognize that that's what I was going for because he
Mhm.
would likely have read the same stuff. Like he is familiar with Foucault and Jameson, whose philosophies sort of run through the book. And in fact, like the sort of crazy old man character that the bishop runs into in the city is more or less a real person. Like it's a philosopher. And Jason was able to be like, oh, I know who that is because he's saying that philosophy. And that's sort of just a weird Easter egg thing. It's not like it had any direct bearing on anything. Um, but it was at that level in terms of like mutual recognition of the same types of really like lit theory nerd stuff, you know. um but also, I mean, in the same way, right, that like if you're working with an editor that's way into sword and sorcery and you fill your work with like SNS DNA, right? You're gonna feel confident that like this guy's gonna know or this person's gonna know what I'm doing, and they're not gonna be like, this is weird. Why did you do it this way? Like, could you give me more detail about how the money works in this economy? Um, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, this I see what you're going for. So it gave me a sense of trust, I guess, knowing that he wasn't going to push back on some of the more weirder elements because I knew that he would recognize what they were. Which again doesn't mean that they like are, you know, effective or work all the time, especially for someone that's not into lit theory. But I knew he was. So, you know, in some ways, like at a certain level for a while, like he was the audience, right? And so I
Hmm.
knew that that's in some ways what I was writing or who I was writing toward.
Well, it
Um,
sounds like I don't know if would you agree with this, but like it sounds like that gave you freedom to push further in the direction
yeah,
that you
I
feel
think so.
inclined to
Yeah,
do.
because
So,
I
is that
knew
not a
he,
great thing with an editor?
yeah,
You know.
he wanted to engage with experimentation. So I knew that I could do like this weird dialogue form, and I knew that it would, you know, not necessarily like immediately get the stamp of approval, but I knew that he wouldn't immediately be like, "Oh, this is weird. Like you can't do this. Like don't do this. Like don't do
Yeah.
this." Um, so and he's been nothing but like supportive through this whole process, and I mean, this is my first major work of this type of length, and so I'm just super appreciative of the support and the opportunity that the book represents. Um, just as is. Um,
Awesome. Okay, so it is the Bishop's Tale, and as you mentioned, it is kind of a prequel to something you've already written. But I hear the Bishop's Tale, my brain goes to like Canterbury Tale, and I'm like, oh, is there going to be this guy's tale and that person's tale? Do you have any plans for the future for more novellas, either about this character or other characters in the setting, fleshing it out, a la Canterbury Tales or something like that? What's coming down the pipe, if anything?
yeah, so I already have the novel is completed. The novel that follows this one. The bishop is not in the novel. He is just like he's mentioned, like this is the guy that gave us the manuscript to transcribe. And so the novel follows a monastery and a nearby village as they transcribe this manuscript that the bishop thinks is going to somehow save the world, or not save the world, but to better know of the revelation, which is like a specific way that I wanted to talk about what he thinks he's doing. It's about epistemology, not necessarily like salvation, but he still thinks in some ways it's about salvation. Uh, but so the novel follows them. The second, like the one after that, which I'm currently, that's on my like my current writing project when I have time, is going to bring the bishop back into the story and sort of to interact with the characters from the novel. And my intent, speaking of Canterbury Tales, is to do or try to like a mosaic novel, which is basically just a form where you're jumping around in different moments in characters, not too dissimilar from like what Martin does himself in some of his Song of Ice and Fire novels, but
Mhm.
closer to something like A Brief History of Selling Seven Killings by Marlon James, but not near as insane as that book is.
I often think, well, tell me if you agree with this. I often think of the Mosaic novel, which is definitely on my bucket list to write one, as essentially, yeah, like a collection of stories all centered on the same location, usually a village or like a workplace or something. And each story is like, okay, well, now we're following this character, and the person who was the protagonist in the previous story might show up as a supporting character in this one. And we just kind of like rotate between the members of the village or the employees at the ad agency or whatever the heck it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, that is the intent, and that is what. And that one, I want to do the same. Like, there's a sequence, like a whole sequence that's going to follow one of the two of the monks, I guess, in their own little journey. But I want to try and write that one in verse, just like Alan Moore did with his book. I want it to be the same meter that Dante used in English, not Italian. But I still want to try and like do something. And I am not a poet. Like I doubt it, not every line is going to land, but you write enough of them, one of them's going to be good. And
Well, I mean, you say you're not a poet, but like, guess what? You write more poetry, and you can be yeah. Congratulations, you're a poet. Like,
yeah, it's funny, the novel itself, which is tentatively called Worm, the one about the monastery. I have the monks engage in what's basically like a 1300s rap battle where they are like trading verses
kind of
about.
like flighting.
Yes, yeah.
Nice.
It's very silly, it's very dumb, but it's like, what are these guys going to do the whole time? Like, they're not just going to sit around and talk about the Bible constantly. Like they were like, they were just normal dudes who got bored. And they would have used the popular form of entertainment, which would have been poetry and songs, right? So I wanted to have that sequence. But anyway, so that's currently, I have like another sort of, I had a story in Old Moon, I think number 6, I think. But that takes place in like a secondary world that I have more stories that I want to tell in. And there's a novella project that I want to do in that setting that I've started. And again, it's just the time issue.
Well, I mean,
But
that's the
yeah,
never-ending battle, right? So,
exactly. Yeah. But I really like playing in the world of like history plus fantasy because it allows me to talk about, again, like real world Christianity, but butted up against, just crazy monsters and stuff. So I want to finish out like that kind of trilogy of books, and whether I would like it to get released in some form or fashion, that's its own game. But I want to finish that out just for myself. And yeah, in the meantime, if everyone listening could personally go buy at least like 100 copies, that would be great. You don't even have
that's
to read it.
the drink minimum, folks, 100.
Yeah. Yep.
And they could buy it from, I believe, Amazon.com, right?
Yep. Amazon.com or Bookshop, if you want to go that route. Either is fine. Like I said,
And if,
you don't even got to read it. Just buy it.
oh, you should probably read it, folks. I mean, for heaven's sakes, it's a novella. You can find the time. And I think it is well worth reading, which is one of the reasons why I reached out to you, Matt, to have this conversation in the first place. I think it's a good book. I think more people should check it out. And I'm keen to see to see more of what comes from both you and the Keen Blades line. Last question: if people want to follow you specifically and to get updates on what's up with Matt and all his writing, what do you have a website, or is there a social media platform you prefer?
I am not a big social media guy. I am on Twitter, I think, at Matt Holder 93, I think.
That does tend to be your handle, yeah. So let's go with that,
Yes.
Matt Holder.
I'm more active on like the Whetstone Discord or the Nest Discord. Like you'll see me in there more often, and if anything new happens, like that's where I would announce it. I'm really bad at like the indie side of promotion, just because I'm just bad at it, and I just don't want to. I just it's like social media, like the brain rot is so real for me. I try to, I need to do a better job of avoiding it, but I am on there. Yeah.
All right, well, look for him on Discord and Twitter, Matt Holder 93. All right, man. Thank you so much for your time today. I think we've had a pretty solid chat. I enjoyed it, and hopefully, listener, you enjoyed it too. Go to
Yes.
Amazon and find that book. God damn it, 100 copy minimum. Don't forget.
Yes. Thank you so much, Oliver. I super appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to everybody listening.
No problem, man. So I'm Writing a Novel features original intro and outro music by Gloria Guns and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us at soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, or checking out any of the other ways you can support the show by heading to soimwritinganovel.com/support the show, which has things like links to our Patreon, Ko-fi, and PayPal. Thanks for hanging out with me, and Matt, and I'll see you soon.